Hey, I'm Neil Parfit. Welcome to my channel. This is Synthesizers for Noobs Part 2. It's my series about how synthesizers work without being a total nerd about it. So I want to do this in non-nerd speak as much as possible. So if you're just getting into this journey, you'll walk away with some information that will help you along the path. And there's a lot of people I've talked to out there who are like, synthesizers sound cool, but they look intimidating and I have no idea what the hell's going on. So with this, I hope I can give you the information so you can look at this stuff and be like, I get how this works now, or at least I have a fundamental grasp of the flow of how it all works. And then as long as you have that surface level info, you can dive deep over time while getting results right away. And that's the thing. If you had to learn how a combustion engine works before learning how to drive, driving wouldn't be a fun thing. So we're doing the opposite. We're learning to drive, and then we'll learn how the engine works. So that's kind of a cheesy explanation, but I think you know where I'm going with this. So let's move onwards. So if you're just diving into this, you've probably noticed there's a whole bunch of different jargon when it comes to synthesis types. There's subtractive and additive and physical modeling and FM and granular and a whole bunch more. And what is all that stuff anyway? So here's how I'd explain different synthesis methods. Think of the ending sound as a meal, and all those different synthesis types as different types of cuisine. So you have all the same kind of ingredients maybe, and if you cook them together a certain way, your result might be Italian, it might be Indian, it might be Jamaican, it might be a hamburger. I actually don't know, is that American? I don't know. I'm Canadian. I actually don't know what an American dish really is. So I'm just gonna go with hamburger. Those are all different synthesis methods. So let's narrow down the synthesis types to two, additive and subtractive. And let's compare it to food again. So with additive, imagine you went on a massive grocery run, you get home, you dump all your groceries out on the kitchen table, and then you're hungry and you're looking at these ingredients and you're like, I have no idea what to make or where to start. All I know is I'm hungry and I want a result. And additive synthesis is sort of like that. You're starting out with raw sine waves, which are those purest waveforms I talked about in video 1, and you're adding a whole stack of those together to try and come up with something. And because you're starting from nothing, it's actually very complicated to get good results that way. Whereas with subtractive synthesis, it's the complete opposite. So imagine you're at a party and you're handing your phone around while ordering a pizza. And then when the pizza arrives, someone ordered way too many ingredients on the pizza. And you're like, whoa, there's like 10 things on here, including anchovies and pineapple. Not my thing. But if I remove the anchovies and the pineapple, this is actually a good pizza. And that's exactly what subtractive synthesis is. You're starting off with a very rich kind of waveform, and you're taking stuff out of it to get a result. So going back in time, this is a Moog Model D, first created in 1970. This is one of the first portable, if not the first portable synthesizer that musicians could throw in their car and go to a gig with. Before that, it was all modular synthesizers. It was like those big walls of buttons and dials and wires coming out of it. And just as an example, here's modular right there. Obviously, I can't throw that in my car easily. Whereas this thing, I can wrap it in a towel and throw it in my back seat. And because of that, it's light, it was affordable, and it sounds good. That's what made these things explode in popularity. So there's three important things I want to mention about this synthesizer behind me. And again, this is a MiniMoog Model D. And the first thing is, it is a subtractive synthesizer. So we're starting with that pizza with too many toppings and then taking some toppings away to get a pizza that we like the taste of. And then number two, it's a monophonic synthesizer. So this isn't like mono versus stereo. Monophonic means you can only play one note at the same time. I can't play a chord on it. I can only play discrete notes. So just like a bass guitar or something like that in most cases. So coincidentally, this thing became very popular for playing bass sounds as well as solo sounds because you can't play chords. And the third thing I wanted to mention is that it's an analog synthesizer. So there's no CPU or central brain. There's no lines of code in there. There's no operating system. It's just discrete components generating these waveforms that we can eventually hear. And because of that, it's not 100% consistent. It's not like code where you run it once, it always runs that exact way. This thing can be affected by temperature, an electric contact got oxidized. Like, it's sort of a living, breathing beast, and it's consistent, but it's not. And that's what makes it so interesting, because you'll never get the exact same thing twice, which is it makes it kind of alive in a weird, cheesy way. So one thing I wanted to mention before I switch cameras here is that this synthesizer is 50 years old, and subtractive synthesis is older than that. But the amazing thing is, if I buy a subtractive synthesizer that's modern, 95% of it's the same. Like if I look at a synth from 2 years ago versus this thing, versus something in the 80s, versus the 90s, versus the thousands, you can look at all of them and you can sort of at a glance be like, oh, I can understand the flow of this because they haven't really changed it a lot. And it's like a USB cable of synthesis. Like it's just so ubiquitous. And the cool thing is it has bled into other synthesis types as well. So once you learn this, you can jump to other synthesis methods and sort of have an easier grasp because they're all sharing and pooling from a lot of the same ideas. So anyway, rambles aside, I'm switching cameras and I'm going to ramble more, but we're going to hear stuff. So here we go. So when we're talking about a musical sound, I like breaking it down into 3 factors that happen over time. Number 1, which will be the focus of this video, is pitch. Does it have a stable pitch when you press a key? You know, like a piano or something like that? Or does it sound wobbly or does it sound erratic? That is pitch. And, you know, it can sound low if you press lower on the keyboard, or it can sound higher up if you press higher up on the keyboard. That's pitch control. The second factor is loudness over time. When we talk or an instrument is played, the sound isn't instantly on or instantly off. It might gradually creep up. It might fade in. It might sort of fade out over time. We're never talking like this all the time. You know, there's a certain shift in loudness that happens that helps sculpt what a sound sounds like. And the third factor is timbre or tone. Does it sound bright and buzzy? Is it mellow sounding? Does it sound rich? Does it sound hollow? Like all these different kind of descriptors, like that is the tone or the timbre of a sound. And the relation between pitch, loudness, and timbre, manipulating all those things at the same time is what will give us our musical sound, or a non-musical sound, depending on what you're after. So let's start off with pitch. In video number 1, we talked about oscillators, and all that is a device that creates a repetitive waveform over and over and over again. And the speed of that repetition is called a frequency. And if that wave plays fast enough, we're going to start to hear it. And in human ears, that's about 20 hertz or 20 repetitions per second. That's like the lowest of the bass, like the brown note, that kind of thing. And if it keeps playing faster than that, it's going to get higher and higher and higher in pitch, all the way up to 20,000 hertz, which is at the upper range of human hearing. So sometimes you'll hear audio reviews like, oh, it was clear from 20 to 20. That just means it was able to reproduce sound from 20 hertz all the way up to 20 kilohertz. And we can demonstrate this right now using this synthesizer. So you'll notice on this synthesizer, we have oscillator bank. That means we have multiple oscillators here. And to the right of it, you'll see we have mixer. And that's exactly what it sounds like. It's going to let us mix these signals together and blend them to taste. So let's do this now. We're going to focus on listening to one oscillator. So here's our oscillator number 1, and here's the volume control for oscillator number 1. So I can turn it on, and I can turn up the volume. And you'll notice I play a key, all we hear is the slightest tick. If we go up an octave, notice how it's playing faster. It's playing twice as fast. And again, twice as fast again. And then twice as fast again. We're hearing this consistent buzz that's getting faster. Let's change the range of this oscillator so it's playing even faster. Now you notice we're starting to hear some bass because the repetitions are fast enough that we're able to hear it properly. There we go. Our range control is like an octave switch. And all that's doing is doubling the speed of the waveform. So if I want to make a bass sound, I'd set this lower. If I wanted it to be like a solo sound, I might set it a few notches up. Pretty simple so far. But what's the connection between this keyboard and this oscillator? Like, what's to say that This is an A, and that's a C. And the answer is nothing. This is a pure analog instrument. So this oscillator doesn't know what these pitches are in relation to other instruments. So we actually have to tune this thing. And that's why over here on the right, we have this thing called A440. So in Western culture, 440 vibrations a second, that's an A. So if I turn this on, that's our A reference. So I'm going to play an A on the keyboard. Not in tune. So all we have to do is just adjust the tuning of this instrument until they sound the same. And it's almost like tuning guitar strings. That's pretty bang on. So there we go. So now we have a musical relation in the real world. This A is going to be compatible with what a guitarist would play if they play an A, or a violinist, and on it goes. Versus being like, okay guys, are you ready? I'm at 440 hertz and I'm just going to adjust this knob. It's like, no, I know if I play an A, it's going to sound like an A. So let's listen to these waveforms. And you'll notice they all have different symbols here. We're not going to go over all of them, but we're going to go over the main three that you'll see in most synthesizers. So the first is called a triangle wave. And it's called a triangle because literally it looks like a triangle. If we look at it on the scope, it looks like a triangle. You notice it sounds pretty pure. It has a little bit of buzz, but not a lot. And if we go to this one, this is called a saw wave. And again, it's a very literal thing. If we look at it on a scope, it looks like a saw. And you'll notice it sounds very buzzy. It sounds very rich. This is actually the richest waveform out of our selection. And we'll go one more here. This is called a square wave. And again, it's because it literally looks like a square wave on a scope. And we have a few variations of a square wave. And basically, instead of it being symmetrical like that, it's modifying the symmetry. So take a listen. So let's review the sound of these waves again. So let's go to triangle. And you'll notice that, again, it's pretty pure sounding, has a slight buzz. But overall, it sounds pretty solid. It's a good bass sound. And now let's go to the saw. Notice it's very buzzy. It's very rich in sound. Let's take a listen to the square wave. You'll notice that it is buzzy, but it also sounds kind of hollow. It's just a completely different character from the saw and the triangle. And if we pick another one with a different symmetry, sounds slightly different again, and a very sharp kind of notch. It even has a more hollowy kind of buzz kind of sound, and that's called a pulse wave, by the way. And you'll notice the sound sounds very video gamey. And same with the square wave. And also the triangle wave, if we go down low enough. And that's because a Nintendo sound chip used these kind of waveforms to create their soundtracks. So this stuff is found everywhere. So at this point, you might be wondering, well, that's one oscillator. Why do we need these other oscillators? And we can sum that up to a real world example, which is a choir. If you have one person singing a line, it sounds good. If you have two people singing a line, it sounds thicker. And that's exactly what we can do here with these oscillators. So I'm going to pick a waveform here like the saw, and let's turn on oscillator 2 and take a listen. There's definitely no tuning happening here, so we have to tune our second oscillator. So I'm going to put it into the same range as the first one. And I'm going to set the waveform to a saw as well. Doesn't sound right yet, so we can just use this tuning control. So there we go. We have two oscillators playing the same pitch. They're not exactly the same. We're hearing a little bit of variation. Kind of like guitar strings wavering. And if we sort of set them out of tune from each other just a hair, it's going to sound a lot thicker. So now if we play a bass line, versus just a single oscillator, so we can do the same thing. We can add in oscillator 3 now. So here we have 3 oscillators playing the same waveform in the same range all together. So it's a very thick sound, but those are all still multiples of the original frequency. It sounds like the same pitch, or octaves if you want to call it that. But there's no rules here. We can tune this to anything else we want. So let's take a listen. So now we're sort of cheating chords, because remember I said that this is a monophonic instrument. We can't play chords. We can only play one note. We can also do another cheat here. Let's think of guitar power chords. That's usually a 1, a 5, and an octave up. So this, all playing at the same time. So what if we take our second oscillator and detune it up to the 5th? And then instead of our third oscillator playing this low note, we'll bump it up to here. So if we listen to each oscillator by itself, and then if we play them all together, so we have a keyboard version of a guitar power chord. And we can mix and match these waveforms however we want. So let's take a listen. So there's no rules here. So far we've talked about changing the tuning of these oscillators to create a bigger sound. But what's another musical aspect of pitch that we're missing? What if we want to emulate, a string bending on a guitar or something like that? We can't bend these keys. We need something else. Because not all things in the real world are fixed steps like this. If I slide down a string on a guitar or something like that, that's going to give us a smooth bend. And we can accomplish that here with this tool, which is our pitch wheel. It's going to add or decrease the voltage coming from this keyboard, feeding those oscillators. So take a listen to this. So let's listen to this in a more musical context. We can bend notes like a guitar, or maybe something like this. So you can have some fun with this depending on the kind of music you're working on. So that's the second way we can control pitch in combination with this keyboard. What's the third way? Right now, if I wanted to jump between these two notes, it's an instant jump in pitch. What if we wanted to jump down to that note, almost like you were sliding down on a string or something like that, which is portamento, connecting the notes together. We can do that. We can turn on this glide mode, and we can increase the glide time, and take a listen to this. Notice how the notes are blending together now versus this. And if you set it too slow, it's not fast enough based on your performance to get down and back. So take a listen to this. I'm just going to increase it as I play this performance. So glide is another method to add a little bit more musicality to our notes. And on certain keyboards, this might be called glide, it might be called portamento, it might be called slew. It's all the same thing. It's basically, instead of these stepped voltages between keys, it's sort of muddling it to like a curve. So that's number 3 in our tools for controlling pitch. So I've gone back down to a single oscillator triangle wave. Let's talk about the 4th way we can affect pitch. If we listen to this, and we think of a vocalist or a brass instrument or woodwinds, what are we missing here? In the real world, the pitch of a sound isn't perfectly stable like that. That would be the equivalent of real-world auto-tune, which isn't the case. Real-world pitches fluctuate up and down from our main fundamental frequency here. So if it's a singer, you get a little bit of a wobble below and above the pitch, and that's called vibrato. So we need to be able to create a consistent wobble in the pitch, and we have the tools. We have this oscillator bank, and so far we've been using them in an audible way. We can hear them. So first things first, what would happen if we disconnected the pitch control of this oscillator from the keyboard? We can do that. We can turn off this oscillator 3 control. So this oscillator is at a fixed speed, and it sounds terrible. But what happens if we slow it down? Still sounds terrible. What happens if we turn off being able to hear oscillator 3, and instead we have this oscillator modulating the pitch of the first oscillator? Let's take a listen. And we have this modulation wheel here, which increases the intensity, and let's hear what happens. We're getting this weird sort of wobble. Let's get something a little bit more consistent, a little bit more symmetrical. Let's use the triangle wave. And let's slow it down even more. We're going to go to low, which means low speed, low frequency, or LFO, a low frequency oscillator. Let's take a listen now. It's a little slow, but you can see on the scope, the waveform's getting bigger and smaller. It's wavering. What if we speed that up a little bit more? That's sort of more in line with what a musical instrument would do. So let's take a listen. Could even speed it up a little bit more to taste. And there you go. That's how we get vibrato. So that's what we're doing. We're taking this low frequency oscillator. We're not hearing it, but instead we're getting that waveform to affect the pitch of our first oscillator. And if we have it too drastic, it starts to sound a little bit ridiculous. Things can get even more interesting if we turn back on our glide. If we set it a little bit too high, it starts to sound like a spooky ghost. So you get the idea. There's a lot of flexibility here. If we up the intensity of it and maybe pick a more drastic waveform, we're getting into some more video game sound effect territory. So what about Donkey Kong with Mario walking? Or what if instead of this triangle wave, what if we used the saw? So it instantly goes high and then drops low and then jumps up high again. So if we go up high enough, we start getting into laser blast territory from the 70s and 80s in TV shows. Or if we pick the saw going up the other way, again, we're getting into some more like spaceship kind of stuff, some like Pac-Man, that kind of idea. So another thing we can do is we can use this square wave, which is an instant high, instant low sound, and tune it. And if we play it fast enough, we can sort of cheat a really fast arpeggio. So and we can turn back on Oscillator 2. So you can see there's a lot of flexibility using an LFO to modify the pitch of your oscillators. You can also get into some really interesting effects if you take this LFO and speed it up so fast that it's in the audio range. So for today, that's my overview of pitch. And just as a recap, our main oscillator 1, we can tune it so it makes sense with this musical keyboard. So here's our A440. And I've tuned it so this note is the same. And that gives us a musical reference if we're playing with other players or if we're recording performances with other instruments. Then we can take a second oscillator and we can blend it in with the first one. And we can tune it however we want, and it will always be relative to what the first oscillator is doing. So that allows us to cheat with chords. We can even add in a third oscillator if we want to. And another interesting thing we can do is we can disconnect oscillator 3 from this keyboard control. We can turn it off so we can't hear it. We can slow it right down, and we can have it control the pitch of oscillator 1 and 2. And that gives us our vibrato. We can also use this pitch wheel to add or subtract voltage from what our keyboard is sending to these oscillators. So and last but not least, we have this glide control. So that allows us to break apart these perfect steps and glide between them. So, and with those 4 types of pitch control, we have tons of flexibility to dive into building some sounds. All right, so that's it for this video. We've covered pitch control on the synthesizer. Next video, we're going to talk about the change of loudness and the change of timbre over time. And between pitch, loudness, and timbre, we can use all 3 of those to sculpt some really cool sounds. So until then, feel free to leave some comments or questions, and I'll talk to you all soon. Take it easy. See you later.